All right. Hello, everyone. So this is going to be a shortened version of the presentation that I typically would provide on toxic masculinity and violence. So the main objectives of this presentation are first to define the sociological theory of hegemonic masculinity. So up to this point in this course, we've largely been focusing on the big three theories in sociology, which are, of course, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. But as we venture into different topics of social problems, I'm also going to start incorporating a few more advanced theories that are more specifically focused within subfields within sociology. So in the subfield of gender studies, hegemonic masculinity is a theory that's pretty heavily used to help explain social problems and inequalities that stem from our society's construction of masculinity. So we're going to take a closer look at that today, and then more specifically explain how hegemonic masculinity causes different social problems through both the marginalization of femininity and the destruction of male bodies. So to begin, what is hegemonic masculinity? Well, it's a theory that the dominant ideas about what it means to be a man in any given society influence the behaviors of actual men in that particular society. Hegemonic masculinity is socially constructed, which means that it varies from society to society. It reflects any given society's current arrangement of practices that serve to both legitimize and endorse, oftentimes privilege, men's dominant position in society. Given our society's binary understanding of gender, meaning that we typically understand gender as being either men or women, masculine or feminine, hegemonic masculinity serves to reinforce that binary. And since it's really amping up and endorsing all aspects of men in masculinity in any given society, it subsequently results in the marginalization or the subordination of both women and all things feminine in any given society. So this translates into hegemonic masculinity subordinating women, feminine appearance and gender behaviors, as well as gay men who also oftentimes get stereotyped as being effeminate in society as well. It's important to recognize that what is considered the hegemonic form of masculinity, or we could also say the dominant form of masculinity, changes and varies across societies and across different times and cultures as well. So for example, what is considered the hegemonic masculine norm in the United States, or even here more specifically in Texas, might not necessarily be the hegemonic masculine form in other societies across different times and places. So while all men experience some form of societal pressure to conform or aspire to the hegemonic masculine standard in their society, very few men actually completely conform to the ideals of hegemonic masculinity. So it's really not an attainable result for many people. If you think of, the very machoist of all men in any given society, whether you think of actors or athletes, etc., whom you think possess all of the attributes of masculinity that are praised in our society, realistically, very few people have the physical strength and the intellect and the financial gains and all of these attributes of masculinity that we would kind of ascribe to a person that is super masculine in society. Very few people actually reach that actual level of masculinity, but it is something that we as men in any given society are socialized to strive for. We want to be strong, we want to be wealthy, we want to have power in all these ways that are associated with masculinity in any given society. So what do you think are some of the main tenets of hegemonic masculinity in our current society? I think a way to think about this is to be even more specific. What do you think it means to, quote unquote, be a man in the year 2020 in South Texas? So what are some attributes that you associate with masculinity, with kind of the supreme form of masculinity for a Texas man in 2020? Some people might think, associations with being a cowboy, drinking, owning a gun, liking football, being able to barbecue, being strong, playing sports, etc. All of those are just a number of different tenets that we associate with hegemonic masculine standards in our current society, but that it's not necessarily the hegemonic standard for masculinity in all societies. Other societies might more heavily value men who are intellectual versus just being physical in nature, etc. So it's important to recognize that every society socially constructs what they consider to be the most important masculine traits, and it's those traits that all men in that society get held accountable to act towards or to try and achieve, even though very few of us actually embody all of those actual traits. So I think a helpful way to think of hegemonic masculinity is to kind of consider it like a yardstick up against which all men are constantly being evaluated. So you might think of some very, very masculine men in our society, again, thinking of like celebrities or athletes specifically that you associate with being hyper-masculine, but then recognize how few people actually embody that hyper-masculinity. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you might have men that are very feminine in our society, men that get labeled as being sissies in our society, who really go against a lot of the socially expected behaviors for what men in masculinity are supposed to embody, and it's those men that are most largely oppressed due to hegemonic masculinity. Another sociologist by the name of Brannon also made a really valuable contribution to the sociological study of masculinity, and he essentially said there are 4 basic rules that all men in any given society are expected to follow. And the first of those rules is no sissy stuff, which essentially means that masculinity is based off of the relentless repudiation of anything feminine. So to be a man means to distance yourself from femininity as much as you possibly can. Another tenet that Brannon suggested was being a big wheel. Masculinity is measured by wealth, power, and social status. So to be masculine in society is to have a lot of material things. It's to be in positions of power, both in work and within your social and family relationships, and to have that kind of prestigious status of having someone who has a lot of financial clout and privilege in society. Another one of Brannon's rules was being a sturdy oak. Masculine men appear reliable during a crisis. They may not know how to solve the problem, but they do not show any signs of weakness whatsoever. So if you ever think of like in an action movie, if something terrible is about to happen, the hero in the action movie, who's typically a man, is never seen sweating, right? They never get nervous. They never show that they're scared or concerned. So that's what this rule that Brannon is referring to here. Men are a sturdy oak. We never show our signs of weakness. We need to suck it up and be a man in all times, and to never let anyone ever show that we have any flaws to ourselves. And the last rule that Brannon suggested with masculinity was give 'em hell, which essentially refers to that masculine men exude this aura of being daring and being aggressive at all times. We often take risks and live life on the edge to display this give 'em hell attitude. So it's important to note that if men feel that they are lacking in any one of these 4 masculine areas that Brannon outlined, we often try to overcompensate for it in others. So for example, if a man cannot attain the wealth in the high socioeconomic status that's associated with being a big wheel in society, he will likely amp up his masculinity by engaging in extra risk-taking behavior, right? Give him hell attitude, or by further distancing himself from all things feminine, right? No sissy stuff whatsoever. This clearly results in different hegemonic masculine standards for different cultures, socioeconomic statuses, and races, given that not all social groups have the same access to wealth. So we particularly see this in instances where individuals feel like they can't be a big wheel, right? If you can't, advance to the top of the corporate ladder and make 6 figures a year to really demonstrate your masculinity through that particular rule, Brannon argues that men will try and overcompensate for their masculinity in other areas. So that might mean engaging in extra risk-taking behavior, engaging in hyper-masculine behavior, and never ever engaging in anything remotely feminine whatsoever, just to build up one's sense of masculinity. So how does hegemonic masculinity harm society as a whole? Well, these hegemonic masculine standards that society have in place often contribute to toxic masculinity, which was a concept that was discussed in one of the readings for this week. The definition we'll use for toxic masculinity is a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. So essentially saying that to be a man is to engage in these behaviors which are not only harmful towards men, but obviously harmful towards society as a whole. How can you sociologically explain the realities represented by this graph? Take a second, look it in here. This is a graph showing the life expectancy by both gender and race for the year 2011. So what you might have noticed by looking at this graph is that the life expectancy for women in the United States is 81 years of age. But for men, however, it is only 76. So there's a 5-year discrepancy based off of gender here for life expectancy. Now, some people might say, well, this is probably a biological problem. You know, this is something that maybe biologically women are just healthier, they're born healthier, they're less likely to experience diseases. Some people might try and explain it off that way. But in reality, this is really a social problem. Virtually, men die of every preventable disease other than breast cancer at higher rates than women. Men die at higher rates than women for every single preventable disease, every type of cancer, heart disease, etc., other than breast cancer, in comparison to women in the United States today. And it's not because men are born with some sick gene that just predisposes them to these illnesses more. It's because men engage in riskier behavior, engage in higher levels of drinking, in smoking, they're more likely to be the victims of gun violence in comparison to women. And all of these factors have resulted in men having a 5-year lower life expectancy than women in the United States. So let's quickly take a look at a few of these adverse effects of masculinity on men's health. Obviously, striving to meet the current hegemonic masculine ideal exposes men to more life-threatening behaviors. Men are more likely to die from preventable issues, including substance abuse and violence, in comparison to women as a result. So let's take a closer look at masculinity and violence. Typically on any given year, about 90% of murders are committed by men in the United States. About 75% of murder victims are also men. 98% of shooters in mass shootings in the United States are men, the vast majority of whom are white. This is an important statistic because almost always when we have an instance of a mass shooting taking place, which is becoming increasingly common, unfortunately, the headlines will often try and attribute it to mental illness. And this argument does not hold weight in our society, because if mental illness really was the main driving factor behind the motivation for someone to engage in a mass shooting, we would expect there to be gender equality, essentially, across the number of mass shooters, right? Because men and women experience mental illness at relatively similar rates. However, what we see is that 98%, almost 100% of mass shooters are men, right? So this is not a mental health problem. This is a masculinity crisis that we are not addressing in the United States as strongly as we should. So is it a coincidence that men are responsible for virtually all acts of murder? No, it most certainly is not. And it's one of the biggest reasons why we need to address social problems attached to masculinity in the United States today. Masculinity is also linked to help-seeking behaviors. Men are less likely to seek medical care because it is considered unmasculine or feminine for men to admit that they are feeling weak or ever need help. This has life-threatening consequences to men, obviously. In comparison to women, men are about 25% less likely to have visited a healthcare provider in the past year. As a result, men are more likely to die from heart disease and virtually every form of cancer other than breast cancer than women. Masculinity also has some unique ties to mental health. Men are less likely to be diagnosed for mental illnesses, including depression and anxiety, but this is largely because the unique symptoms that men experience in comparison to women are not largely advertised and recognized by the public. So for example, when you think of depression, you probably think of someone who's really sad or quiet, wants to be isolated. However, when men experience depression, their symptoms are more likely to involve being aggressive, substance abuse, engaging in risk-taking behaviors, etc. And given that a lot of these symptoms are included in diagnostic scales, a lot of men who are likely experiencing mental illness will never actually get diagnosed and seek treatment for it because of this miscommunication. While women are more likely to attempt suicide, men are 3 times more likely to actually commit suicide. So how can a sociological imagination help us better understand the intersection of masculinity and mental illness? Something maybe you can unpack in your discussion for this week.